Monsieur le Président, Monsieur President. It's always an honor and a pleasure, Mr. President, to bring the voice of Chatham-Kent-Leamington to this chamber. As my colleague before me, he lamented the fact that he had to speak twice now on this, so I will add to the lament, as this is my third time now rising, because this government is not listening to ordinary Canadians as they are represented in this chamber. But before, Mr. President, I get into the substance of my speech, I want to take a moment to recognize the efforts of 40 extraordinary Canadians, for that is truly what ordinary Canadians are, for bringing the peace train to Ottawa 2 nights ago. MPs from a cross-section of this chamber, representing a cross-section of philosophical paths to peace, from our military veterans and peacekeepers to our peaceniks, all agreed on the message represented by the peace train participants, that Canada should do more for peace in our world. Mr. Speaker, it has been said many, many times that war is a failure of statecraft. Thank you to these folks for reminding us to invest more, in many ways, for peace. And so, speaking of state and government failures, here we are again. Why? Because this current government is ruling like an autocratic regime rather than a parliamentary democracy. Of course, I'm referring to the Green Slush Fund and the Liberal refusal to hand over documents as ordered. This government is not being accountable on any front, Mr. Speaker. What are we talking about today? We're talking about the sub-amendment, which is to be added to the amendment, and it reads as follows: except that the order for the committee to report back to the House within 30 sitting days be discharged if the Speaker had sooner laid upon the table a notice from the law clerk and from the Parliamentary Council confirming that all government institutions have fully complied with the order adopted on June the 10th, 2024, that's my birthday, by depositing all of their responsive records in an unredacted form, end quote. In other words, Mr. Speaker, this government does not have to report back to the House if they actually comply with the ruling of your office. At issue, of course, is the Auditor General's finding that the Liberal appointees gave $400 million tax dollars to their own companies, involving 186 conflicts of interest. This is about $400 million of wasted taxpayer dollars, while Canadians can't afford to eat, heat, or house themselves. The NDP Liberals must end the cover-up and make the unredacted documents available as ordered by the Speaker so that the Parliament can get back to working for Canadians. Let's review a few of the facts. The Speaker ruled that the NDP Liberals violated a House order to turn over evidence to the police for a criminal investigation into the latest Liberal $400 million scandal. But why the cover-up? Why would they allow Parliament to be incapacitated rather than address the issues that Canadians really and truly do care about, like the doubling of housing costs, food inflation, crime and chaos? On the crime front, Mr. Speaker, this government has made a mockery of our justice system. Terry Lynn McClintock, who abducted and then assisted her boyfriend in the sexually motivated killing of 8-year-old Tori Stafford in 2009, was allowed to be in the presence of children through her mother-child program at a women's federal penitentiary. Hard to even fathom. Where's the accountability? And I've spoken so much about accountability in my previous 2 interventions. Time after time, this government has re-victimized victims, just as they did when they allowed Paul Bernardo to be moved out of a maximum security facility. This government created the problem by passing Bill C-83, which ensures that even the worst of the worst, like Paul Bernardo, Luca Magnotta, and Terry Lynn McClintock, must be incarcerated in the least restrictive environment. This Prime Minister has unleashed a wave of crime across this country with disastrous policies like C-5, which took away mandatory jail for violent crime and allowed sex offenders to serve their sentences in the same home as their victims under house arrest. C-65 also made it easier for repeat violent offenders to be given bail. While the Liberals are concerned about heinous criminals being given a less restrictive environment, Canadians suffer the consequences of unrestricted crime and chaos, and again, the victims of crime are re-victimized. This government must be held to account for these failures. They've allowed this Parliament to be paralyzed with their refusal to be transparent on the SDTC documents. Their own self-interest supersedes all other issues in their minds. Refusing to hand over the documents is an affront to this Parliament. What is so bad that they would go to such lengths to hide? Why would this government not instead focus themselves on their own caused food inflation? Mr. Speaker, food bank use has doubled. You heard right, doubled. Wholesale food prices in Canada have risen 36% faster than wholesale prices in the US, a gap that's opened up since the introduction of the carbon tax. Sadly now, there are 2 million people lined up to feed themselves and their families at food banks. Our economy is teetering on the brink, but yet the worst is to come. Mr. Speaker, this coalition government voted for and legislated the quadrupling of the carbon tax to 61 cents a litre. In Ontario alone, Feed Ontario revealed last September that a record 1 million people visited a food bank in Ontario in 2024. This is a dramatic increase of the 25% from the previous year, with Feed Ontario CEOs telling the media that, quotes, they never thought they would see this day. Went on to say, I've been with this organization for 15 years, and I never thought we'd see this level of demand. I cannot believe we reached a point where the numbers are so dramatically high. And yet these Liberals seem oblivious to this suffering. In a parliamentary democracy, the Parliament is supreme. If a citizen finds a certain law repugnant, his only option is to mobilize a change in Parliament. For example, by campaigning in favor of a certain issue, by joining a political party, by standing for office. And such Parliament changes a law. Citizens that disagree with the law of this land and believe that their rights have been violated can push for political change. The rule of law is crucial in a democracy because it ensures that everyone, including government officials, are subject to that law. Key points about the rule of law in a democracy are that equality before the law, regardless of social status, checks on power, yes, that's right, Mr. Speaker, holding the government accountable. That is a fundamental point in the rule of law. Also, the protection of rights, social sustainability, where citizens trust the law will be applied fairly, and also economic development. A strong rule of law fosters a predictable business environment, encouraging investment and economic growth. And it's obviously evident that this government believes that they are above the law and above the sovereignty of this chamber. Holding leaders accountable for serious wrongdoings is a hallmark of democracy, Mr. Speaker, and that's why we're here today. And again, I reiterate, where are the documents? What's in them that are making the Liberals so afraid that the Canadian public will find out? To the matter at hand, Mr. Speaker, let's talk for a moment what the Sustainable Technology Fund could do with respect to research and innovation, and in particular for a moment with the energy sector. If you would please indulge me for a moment as I'll come back to the direct issue of corruption at hand. I've often talked about this next sequence in roundtables and town halls I host. If you think back to the creation and the development and increase of wealth in our Western world, it has largely mirrored the increase and the densification of our energy. When we came out of the caves, Mr. Speaker, we heated ourselves, kept ourselves warm, and heated our food with wood. Over time, we moved to charcoal, coal, onto fossil fuels. Today, we have nuclear energy, potentially tomorrow hydrogen. Each one of these sources of energy has come with its own set of environmental consequences. And as we have moved to that densification of energy, Mr. Speaker, we have found ways of reducing eventually removing, hopefully, environmental consequences. So a question I often ask when I'm hosting roundtables is the following. We often hear now, we hear the opposition speak of fossil fuels, their use. They hope for the day of peak oil, that we get past it. Here's my question to you, Mr. Speaker. When did the world achieve peak coal? Not metallurgical coal that we need for steelmaking, but when did the world hit peak use of thermal coal? I often ask this question at home. And so I get responses from my constituents. Some say, well, it's probably during the 1870s, during the Industrial Revolution, or maybe it was in the roaring 20s, in the lead up to the Great Crash, or more recently, post the Green Revolution, the 1970s. Mr. Speaker, our world hit peak coal, the record use of fossil fuels in the form of coal, in 2023. And we're going to break that record this year. So, but why is that important? Coal has twice the greenhouse gas emissions of liquefied natural gas. If Canada actually truly wanted to address greenhouse gas emissions that had a material effect on the world, we would be championing the use of our clean and ethically produced liquid natural gas. We had 15 projects on the books 10 years ago. That is not what this government has done. We've had the world come asking for that energy. Instead, this government has introduced a carbon tax, which, while it said might make you feel good by patting yourself on the back that you're doing something, Canada produces 1.5% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions. Weather, climate, is a worldwide phenomenon. And if we actually wanted to impact greenhouse gas emissions on a worldwide scale, we actually could. And Mr. Speaker, a carbon tax is not what's going to do it. But we could, not as an end goal a century out, but as an interim step that actually reduced greenhouse gas emissions from a material perspective and funded our own wealth as we transitioned our economy over to even more environmentally benign technologies. That's what we could be doing. And there was a fund set up to direct energy, investment, innovation in that direction. Auditor General took a look at it back in 2017, and that fund was working well. Here we are today, and I will end in a few minutes after speaking an hour already to the corruption that has come from this government. So if we wanted to do something, that's where that fund could actually and truly be making a difference. Instead, we're here talking about corruption. I've spoken at great length in this House about the lack of accountability, about the endemic corruption that is in this government. The lack of accountability by the former employment minister. After months of Conservative prosecution, he finally resigned. Allegations of fraud, of being involved in a private business while sitting at the cabinet table, and fake Indigenous claims weren't enough to remove him from cabinet for months. Why is this behavior seemingly endemic in this government? Earlier this week, the PM defended his minister and claimed, "I'm happy," and I'm quoting here, "that he is continuing to lead on issues around jobs and employment and represent Alberta in our government," end quote. It is now clear that the PM knew about the crime and corruption the other Randy was engaged in the entire time. That wasn't enough to remove him. He knew about the double identity, but chose to look the other way. The Prime Minister knew that the member from Edmonton Centre was operating his own business while sitting at the cabinet table. You may remember the former minister had the nerve to testify that, quotes, Randy referenced in the text was not him, but another Randy who just happened to work at the company he has a 50% ownership stake in. His business partner has refuted these claims, stating now that he was the only Randy who worked at that company. But I guess he thought if the Prime Minister was backing him, he could get away with it. After all, the Liberals have gotten away with a litany of scandals over their rocky 9-year tenure in government. The Prime Minister knew that he was falsely claiming to be Indigenous to steal money from actual Indigenous peoples. After firing a legitimate Indigenous Justice Minister for upholding the rule of law in Canada against his wishes, the Prime Minister decided to protect a corrupt, fake Indigenous Minister. There's a double standard here when it comes to these Liberals. They expect the rest of us to be responsible for our actions, but they are not accountable for theirs. Everything from Frank Baylis and the $273 million scandal to the former Minister Navdeep Bains getting an executive position at Rogers after the government greenlit the Rogers-Shaw merger. And I see, Mr. Speaker, that my time is running short. It is unconscionable, Mr. Speaker, for every member of this House of Commons that swears an oath to uphold the democratic institution of Parliament, because this Parliament, this is the foundation that our nation was founded upon. It is a firm and solid base. Here, as we come here to work every day, we are witnessing the rebuilding of Centre Block. The government is spending between $4.5 and $5 billion, in part to provide a firm and solid foundation under that national treasure. There's an old hymn whose refrain goes something like this: "On Christ the solid rock I stand, all other ground is sinking sand," end quote. When we build a home, the foundation is arguably the most important part. Without a firm foundation, Centre Block would not be secure. Our security in a democracy is the firm foundation that our country was built upon. It provides for the stability upon which we stand. When a democratic government rules as if it were a dictatorship, the supremacy and the stability of Parliament is lost. Freedom is not free, Mr. Speaker. Over 118,000 Canadians have died in military service for our country to keep this land glorious and free. That is a predominant line in our national anthem. It is time that this government adhere to the principle of the rule of law in Canada. The fundamental principle of the rule of law means that everyone is subject to the same laws and no one is above the law. The rule of law is based on the idea that laws should be applied fairly and equally to all people, regardless of their power, wealth, or societal position. It is time to restore accountability and democratic freedom in Canada. Conservatives will continue to hold this government accountable and demand that the documents be released in an unredacted form. When will this government call a carbon tax election so that Canadians can vote out this out of control, corrupt government and vote in a common sense Conservative government that will axe the tax, build the homes, fix the budget, and stop the crime, and bring home lower prices for all Canadians. For our home, Mr. Speaker, for your home, for my home, for our home, all together now. Let's bring it home.